For decades, the strategy big companies have used for making successful AAA games has been relatively simple. Just spend as much money as humanly possible. Hire the best and brightest talent in the industry. Spend 10 years and hundreds of millions of dollars on making the best game you can possibly make. Cutting-edge graphics, revolutionary motion capture technology for character performances, 8-digit marketing budgets, 8-digit Dunkin' Donut budgets for employee morale. If it costs a lot of money, it's part of the strategy. This formula has been largely successful for decades now, and it's allowed the richest companies in the gaming industry to generally produce the most popular games in the gaming industry. But in the 2020s, this strategy is beginning to fall apart. Warner Brothers spent $200 million on a Suicide Squad game that flopped. Ubisoft reportedly invested over $650 million into Skull and Bones. Have you ever heard of Skull and Bones? No, me neither. No one has. No one in the world. Concord's budget was $700 trillion, and that game peaked at 700 players playing on Steam. Companies are spending the GDP of some small countries on games that don't even get made fun of in donkey videos. The strategy that once worked so well is falling apart because AAA games are fighting a war, and they're fighting a war on two fronts. A war that they're fighting for one of the most valuable commodities in the world: your attention. On the Eastern Front, AAA games are at war with indie games. Indie games in the last 10 years have been taking the world by storm. Once upon a time, indie games were only played by the most hardcore of video game hobbyists. They were niche, they had cult followings. But times have changed. The indie games have started bleeding into the mainstream. In 2024, Lethal Company was in the top 10 highest grossing games on the entirety of Steam. It was making similar money to a FIFA game, a Star Wars game, and an Armored Core game. But whereas these three games all had multi-million dollar budgets with multi-million dollar marketing campaigns, Lethal Company was made by one guy, a former Roblox dev in his early 20s that has been making games out of his bedroom since he was a child. And not only that, but he also kicked off a trend of indie cooperative survival horror games that were all trying to capture the same lightning in a bottle that Lethal Company managed to grab. And those games were pretty damn successful too. And this is just recent examples. The most obvious elephant in the room is Minecraft, a game that started out as an indie game made by one guy that went on to become the best-selling game of all time. In fact, there's quite a few indie games that crack their way into the top 100 best-selling games of all time list. And you might not realize it, but this puts the entire business model of AAA games into jeopardy. If a single guy can spend nothing but his time on developing a game and can have success in the tens of millions of dollars, then the companies that spend over 100 million on developing a game are in some serious trouble. They can get outcompeted by people who spend literally nothing on their projects. And there's 100,000 times more devs spending nothing on their games than there are devs spending hundreds of millions on their games. So it only takes a small percentage of those indie devs to make it big for the AAA gaming industry to have a lot of competition incredibly quickly. You might think that a big company doesn't care about indie devs having success, but you could not be more wrong. Like I said, this is a war being fought over your attention. They're fighting over your eyeballs. You only have a finite amount of time in a day to play a video game, and these developers are all fighting over that finite amount of time. Over your finite amount of time. Every successful indie game is potentially a game that steals the limelight from your billion-dollar mega project. If you're unlucky and you launch your massive game at the same time as some random Roblox furry releases their smash hit, then you could be in some serious trouble. And big companies are noticing this, which is part of the reason why recently all of the big-name gaming companies have been subtly name-dropping Hollow Knight Silksong in as much of their marketing as possible. The Switch 2 event has 8 seconds of Silksong footage, and that 8 seconds of footage immediately goes ultra viral on Twitter within seconds. And I think Microsoft noticed this, because a little while later, Xbox announced their new handheld console, and throughout the entire 3D rendered trailer, there's Hollow Knight Silksong footage running on the device's screen the entire time. Not some major Microsoft title like Halo or Minecraft, no. Hollow Knight Silksong, a game that isn't even out yet, because they understand the power of the indie game. And the funniest part to me is that they were completely right, because their ad campaign went viral all over the internet, with people getting crazy excited, not at the new console, but at the new Silksong footage that they shoehorned into their ad. Silksong just gets their ad campaign free engagement. And the icing on the cake to all of this is that indie games are cheap. Not just to make, but for the end user to buy. I bought Terraria for less than $10 over a decade ago, and I've played it for 1,500 hours. Hell, I bought a random game called Peak for less than $5 on Steam last week, and I've already enjoyed it more than I enjoyed the majority of AAA games that I've played in the last 10 years.
Wait, it's giving off particles?
Yeah.
They're like the revive thing, you know, like the revive debug.
So what if?
But you might be thinking to yourself, why now? Why are indie games threatening AAA games now in a way that they didn't 10 years ago? Well, the answer is simple. With every passing year, the barrier to entry for game development gets lower and lower. The development tools get more freely available, the computer hardware people have in their homes gets more and more powerful, and the internet offers more and more tools to learn the trade than ever before. Improving technology also allows developers to sell their games digitally. Back in the olden days, if you wanted your game to sell, you needed physical discs in actual shop fronts all over the world, and paying for the production and distribution of these physical copies was incredibly expensive. Nowadays, platforms like Steam allows for indie devs to have the exact same level of reach as the most valuable companies in the world. Indie games have always been competing with AAA, but now there's more indie developers than ever before. You've even got Roblox, an incredibly popular platform that incentivizes young people to learn how to make games. And speaking of Roblox, on the western front of this war, we have what I like to call the forever games. Fortnite, League of Legends, Valorant, Roblox, Minecraft. These are what you would call live service games. And some of these games have been popular for longer than half of my viewer base has even been alive. These games do not conform to the traditional video game business model, where you develop a game for a while, sell that game for $60, more like $80, and then go back to work on the next game you're gonna sell. Instead, these games are made to last forever. Constant updates for months, years, decades to come, and you sell stuff inside the game to keep the revenue flowing in. And this business model is working incredibly well for a small number of game devs. Most live service games die spectacularly, but the ones that don't make billions of dollars, and they last for decades. And this creates a very strange gaming industry. Most players, rather than playing a new game every few weeks or months, instead, they are playing the same handful of games for 5 to 10 years straight. Sure, when a new game comes out that they're extraordinarily excited for, they'll go and play it. But games that are able to pry people's eyes away from Fortnite are few and far between. Those games have to be really good and really popular and have really viral word-of-mouth marketing on social media. The players who spend most of their time playing forever games are not the type to be an early adopter into a new AAA title that comes out. But if you're spending hundreds of millions on a AAA release, you need as many early adopters as possible. Back in the good old days, a big game would release and it would take up, let's say 50% of all available attention for a few months. But then that game's popularity would simmer down so that some other AAA game could come along and take up that attention instead. But nowadays, 50% of all players' attention is already taken up constantly by their favorite live service game. That 50% never filters out. This means that AAA companies have less available attention to actually compete for. There's more games to play than ever before, and many of those games are being played for years on end instead of just a couple weeks. But these ultra popular live service games don't just indirectly compete with other game devs. Sometimes they do it very, very directly. If you're a AAA dev and you want to make a sandbox crafting game or a rhythm game, Fortnite isn't just competing with you because it's really popular and takes up people's time. Fortnite is literally, directly competing with you. They are making games exactly like yours, and they're doing it inside of Fortnite with a pre-existing audience that is almost guaranteed to at least attempt to try out their new game. This is a luxury that 90% of all game devs just simply do not have. And if you think that's bad, then go look at Roblox. Roblox is like an IP theft machine. They're not just making games in the same genre as you, they are literally making your game with your IP and everything. If you want to go play a game that has Mario in it, you could go look at Nintendo's backlog of Mario games. Or you could look at the near infinite number of bootleg Mario games of varying quality that users have been creating over the past 15 years on Roblox. Are 99% of all of these games really bad? Yeah, they are. But garbage or not, they are competition. And Nintendo is insanely litigious, and even they have copycat games on Roblox. If Nintendo can't sue the copyright infringement out of Roblox, then truly no one in the world can. It's over. AAA games have been fighting in this war for a while now, and while this battle is certainly hurting their popularity, I don't think it's gonna kill AAA games outright. Instead, I think it's gonna kill a specific type of AAA game. What I like to call the throw shit at a wall type of AAA game. You know, the type where the company just throws their infinite money from their infinite money printer at the game and hopes that big money in equals big money out. Once upon a time, this was a viable business strategy, which is why there's still companies trying to do it. But with all this added extra competition that used to be much smaller, this strategy just isn't gonna work anymore. You actually have to earn your player base, and not just with money, but with interesting stories and interesting gameplay. You can't just buy your way to $1 billion game anymore. Or you could just, you know, only ever release sequels to your pre-existing popular games for the rest of time. Or better yet, just make remasters of all your existing games, like 10 times in a row. You know, that's probably also a successful way to make games. Now, there's also something to be said about AAA games being released in completely garbage, unfinished states despite their huge budgets. But sadly, I think that is probably going to be a story for another video. AAA games used to be the main way we played games, but now they're just becoming part of a bigger whole, with indie games and live service games now taking up their own enormous share of the pie. And there is a third contender, that being mobile games, which in terms of revenue is bigger than the entire rest of the gaming industry combined. But mobile games deliver a much different experience from traditional PC and console games, so it doesn't really feel like these guys are actually part of this war whatsoever. More just like a giant amalgamation of microtransaction-fueled hellscapes that exist on an island all on their own. But all of this does mean that AAA game companies have got to be careful, because you can only throw hundreds of millions of dollars into doomed projects so many times. Make this mistake one too many times, and these guys are going to take your throne and take it permanently. Thanks for watching.